and welcome everybody. Um, Although the title refers to impact, implementation and the future of work, we're actually going to look at a few of the more detailed issues, typically the relevance of these to industries, the relevance to professions. We'll touch a little on that big elephant in the corner, the matter of implementation, but maybe most importantly, what does all this mean to you as an individual? First, a little about myself. As David explained, I've got quite a number of years in industry, most recently as an IBM executive, focusing on data and analytics. But currently, my day job is very much around mentoring, lecturing, advisory board. I've also been fortunate enough to have published 3 books, and the book on the right of your screen, Advanced Analytics and AI, will fundamentally be the major element of the contents of this particular presentation. Last year, I was very flattered to have it made into an audio book, but I heard it lasts 11 hours. So I'm going to try and condense 11 hours into about 20 minutes. So we better get on with it now. If we're thinking about the future of work, we really need to think about what work means to us and its changing nature. And the reality is that work has continued to change pretty well since the whole concept was invented. And we think, of course, of the movement from the dark satanic mills, the cotton industry, etc., all the way through to an era now of increasingly home working and technology. But the real issue is, what will the age of advanced analytics and AI really mean to us in terms of the issue of work, the function of work? And to address that question, we really have to ask ourselves, why do we work? What is it that makes us get out of bed in the morning and actually fulfill a function which we describe as work? Of course, it's partly about paying the bills and paying the mortgage and affording a holiday one day. But also, if we believe what Maslow has to tell us, ultimately it's about self-fulfillment. It's about realizing our individual potential. And if we look to the future and think that advanced analytics and AI will impact on work, what will happen if those jobs start disappearing? How will we change? For some of us over the past weeks, during the period of furlough, living without work has been really quite an extraordinary experience indeed. But let's look specifically at some of the industries involved. What we recognize is that industries are adopting advanced analytics and AI at different rates. And I categorize these into what I describe as tier 1 industries, financial services, auto, media, retail, and tier 2, construction, education, agriculture, etc. And of course, from an implementation point of view, the issue is, do you want to be a first mover? Do you want to be an innovator? Or do you want to take the more risk-averse approach of being the tier 2, the second mover, learning from the tier 1 movers' mistakes, sorry. What we increasingly see also is a convergence between tier 1 and tier 2. And of course, in the eyes of the customer, they don't actually see a tier 1 or a tier 2, but rather an online experience. I thought it would be useful also to comment very briefly on what has happened as a result of the pandemic. And we see 6 industries specifically likely to grow: remote collaboration, such as today, online education, online food, service automation, and online entertainment. So it will be interesting to see how these change in an era of AI and advanced analytics. I thought it would be helpful just at this point to provide a little bit of a level check, because of course we think in terms of the 4 levels, the 4 strata of analytics. The basic one, that's a description. Why am I getting the results I'm getting? What are my results? Is there a single version of the truth? And then prediction. How do I anticipate what will happen next from that data? And then the 3rd level, prescription. How do I start building in rules to automate the decisioning? And then the 4th level, the top level, cognitive and AI. And of course, the purists would argue that actually cognitive analytics and AI are quite different. and that with AI you can have hard AI and soft AI. But I think those are maybe presentations for some time in the future. But there are some interesting questions here on this very simple slide to consider. At an organizational level, can you jump into being a cognitive and AI orientated organization, or do you have to go through that maturity curve? Can you become AI orientated without being able to accurately track what the benefits of AI are, which is fundamentally a matter of description? It might be helpful also to look a little specifically at the question of professions. And what we recognize is that as we consider the impact of AI and advanced analytics, we discover a hollowing out effect, which we might identify as being that the jobs at the low end and the jobs at the high end are probably less susceptible to the impact of change. How do we define low end and high end? Well, perhaps based on cost or education or the degree of risk involved. Are there some safety nets? If you are creative, for example, does that provide you in a safe sort of job? Well, nowadays we find computers being able to create music and create artwork without the human being able to identify the difference. So maybe creativity isn't a safety net. Is social intelligence a safety net? Well, it rather depends on how clever the chat box becomes. And also, if you are required to negotiate, is that critical? Does that make you safe? Does that give you safety? Well, who knows? And of course, there will be effects on professions. For example, how will the Office of Finance change as reporting and financial reporting specifically becomes automated? How will entrepreneurism change as we have more time on our hands to think about how matters can be done differently, and that technical capabilities allow us to implement more quickly? And how will management change? That real challenge for those managers who are bringing their businesses through an era for which they have no personal experience whatsoever. The reality is that most of our jobs are at risk. And in my book, I provide a table originated by Oxford Brookes University, which identifies over 700 jobs and ranks them statistically as to whether they are vulnerable or not. So I guess in terms of safety, it's a really good thing if you're a mental health social worker, especially in the current climate. But perhaps if you're an insurance actuary or a telemarketer, maybe you might want to rethink what your future looks like. So the reality is, what does all this mean to us as individuals, and how will we cope? And the reality is that we really fall into two camps: those who are concerned about the future, worried about the disruption, maybe a lack of preparation, and the impact of job losses. And the other camp are the hopeful camp, the optimists, the ones who think that the glass is already half full. They recognize new types of jobs. They redefine work, but try to understand how they will fit into this new definition of work. For all of us, we need to keep informed. We need to keep networked. We need to discuss and contribute and operate outside our comfort zone. And this series of presentations is exactly placed to try and support that discussion and informed. We need to be engaged in the discussion and not victims of the future. And to avoid being a victim, maybe we have to go through a degree of personal reinvention. Let's look into that in a little more detail. A few months ago, I was invited to a university and I stood in front of a room full of university lecturers, and they were concerned that they are teaching their students in a way which is more appropriate to 1950 than 2050. And what they recognized was that because of technology, the way that they will teach and the way that students will learn must change. They recognize that individuals must develop new competences. Unfortunately, we are able to categorize those competences into a series of clusters, and we can cluster them relative to whether the new competence is internal to the business, external to the business, or in fact involves us as individuals, an element which we call self-management. And this slide, for example, gives some examples of typical competences: the management of change, the ability to communicate persuasively, the ability to be able to diagnose and gather information. But at a self-management level, the ability for us to be self-confident, to be flexible, and to have personal credibility. And over the past few weeks, many of us have been forced to develop some new self-management capabilities and competences. But it's not just for us as individuals to make the change. Organisations also have a responsibility. And here we have an example from Fitch Learning of what they describe as being an organisational framework for talent development. And you'll see that it goes far beyond just simple online learning or a little coaching, but rather they think in terms of 5 key categories, including analytics, personalisation, content delivery, which would move their talent, their human assets, from being purely tactical players to become game changers. But Fitch suggests that that period of time might take as much as 6 years. And if you think that's a long time, that corresponds to what Malcolm Gladwell suggested in his book Outliers, that perhaps for us to become true masters may take 10,000 hours of true learning. So the reality is, be it 10,000 hours or 6 years, we have to start now. The elephant in the corner, of course, is the issue of implementation. And although my book does contain a number of guidelines, there is not one single solution for all organisations. But there are some key questions and some key rules which might be possible to be followed. For example, what might be your strategy? Where might an organisation start to implement AI and analytics in their organisation? Do they change like a big bang, or do they do it incrementally? How do they organise issues of leadership and sponsorship, especially looking at the churnage of executives in large organisations nowadays? How do they build a team, especially when the most talented people are very eager to make progress quickly, and if they are not satisfied, they will jump ship? So how do they find the right people, and how do they retain them? And how do you measure progress? Because if you can't measure progress, if you can't measure the delta, then how can you demonstrate to the leaders and sponsors that the money being spent is worthwhile? It's that element of description I mentioned a few slides ago. So of course there are issues of training, knowledge management, videos, on-demand learning, and self-learning. But all this now wrapped in what we describe as being the new workplace, the new workspace where we are increasingly living and working from the same environment. When I was invited to speak, the guy said, could you include a case study? And gosh, there are so many case studies, but the one I settled on was the Ping An Good Doctor, a Chinese orientated analytically infused healthcare management system. And if you haven't heard of Ping An, they are the world's most valuable insurance brand for 4 years in a row. And the Ping An Good Doctor, which principally responds to their healthcare insurance scheme, is an online health consultancy. In 2018, there were 250 million customers, and because of the pandemic, they added a further 1 billion customers. And Good Doctor, the Ping An Good Doctor, is not only analytically driven, but also manages a complex ecosystem. But Good Doctor actually reminds us that there are many lessons to be learned from successful implementation. For them, operating at scale over 1 billion customers appears to be a key demand for them. It is, of course, because of the population of China. But for them, the operational requirement was driven by the movement of people from the rural areas into the cities, a megatrend which we call urbanization. So therefore, Good Doctor was developed to respond to a need, as opposed to a capability being created and then thrown at the wall trying to find a problem. Good Doctor is an intelligent system, but designed by subject matter experts. So technologists and subject matter experts work together as a team. It recognised that success requires a complex ecosystem, that there are many partners, many other elements involved. But of course, purists might say that Good Doctor isn't a pure AI or advanced analytic solution. So I thought I would mention one specifically related to COVID-19. Again, I apologize for it being Chinese, but it's an interesting viewpoint. They have discovered that it takes between 5 and 15 minutes to analyze the CAT scan, the analysis of the lungs of a suspected patient, requiring more than 300 images. But one of the largest tech providers, Alibaba, recognizes that they can use algorithms to complete the recognition process within 20 seconds, alleviating pressure on both doctors and hospitals. So think of that, 15 minutes to 20 seconds. And with more computing power, maybe you could reduce that to maybe 1 or 2 or even a smaller amount of seconds. But actually, that's happening more quickly than doctors can even respond. So that really starts asking us some interesting questions, again, about the future of work and the future of doctors in the healthcare system. So coming to the end of this 20 minutes session or whatever, we've really rattled through. We've spoken about the meaning of work. We've spoken about the impact on professions. We've spoken about issues of implementation. But at the end of the day, what does all this mean to you as an individual? And I found a quote by a guy called Robert Cannon, and he kind of summed it up quite seriously and soberly for me. He said, what can a human contribute to working? What can a human contribute to the world of work? And if a job is one where that question cannot be answered positively, then in the future, ladies and gentlemen, that job is unlikely to carry on. That job is likely to cease to exist. So with that sobering thought, I'd like to bring this short presentation to a conclusion. You'll find my contact details on Facebook and on the web and pretty well everywhere you look. Thank you.